Sometimes the people who dedicate their lives to saving others become the very ones who need saving the most. Sarah Martinez had spent 15 years stitching wounds, stopping bleeding, and bringing hope back to broken bodies in the emergency rooms of Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods. Her hands, steady as a surgeon's clock, had guided thousands back from the edge of death. She was known as the miracle worker, the doctor who never gave up, the woman who could heal anyone. But on a cold February night in 2019, those same healing hands would hold a gun. And in one moment of desperation, one pull of a trigger, everything she had built would crumble. The woman who had saved so many lives would take one. The healer would become the wounded, and the bullet she fired wouldn't just end a life. It would begin a journey that would test everything she believed about justice, forgiveness, and the thin line between victim and villain. This is the true story of how a saint became a sinner, and how one night changed not just 2 lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to survive. Sarah Martinez never planned to become a hero. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of South Chicago, she watched her community bleed from violence, poverty, and neglect. Her mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on their table, and her father left when she was 12, unable to handle the pressure of raising a family in a place where gunshots were as common as church bells. But Sarah was different. While other kids her age were getting involved with gangs or dropping out of school, she spent her afternoons at the local community center, volunteering to help elderly residents with their medications and reading medical textbooks she borrowed from the public library. Her fascination with healing began when she was 14 and watched her neighbor, Mrs. Doe Rodriguez, die from a heart attack because the ambulance took 45 minutes to reach their street. That night, Sarah promised herself she would learn how to save people. The path wasn't easy. Sarah worked nights at a gas station throughout high school, saving every penny for college. Her grades were perfect, but her family couldn't afford the application fees for most universities. She applied to only 3 schools, and when the acceptance letter from Northwestern University arrived with a full scholarship, her mother cried for 3 days straight. Medical school was even harder. Sarah was surrounded by classmates who came from wealthy families who had private tutors and summers spent volunteering abroad. She had calloused hands from years of manual work and an accent that marked her as different. But what she lacked in privilege, she made up for in determination. She studied 18 hours a day, often falling asleep over her anatomy books in the library. During her residency, Sarah chose emergency medicine specifically because she wanted to work in trauma centers that served communities like the one she grew up in. Her professors thought she was wasting her potential, telling her she could make more money in plastic surgery or cardiology. But Sarah had a different definition of success. She wanted to be the doctor who showed up for people who had been forgotten by the rest of the medical system. Her first job was at St. Mary's Hospital, located in one of Chicago's most violent neighborhoods. The emergency room was understaffed, under-resourced, and overwhelmed. On her first night, Sarah treated 7 gunshot victims, 3 drug overdoses, and a child who had been beaten so badly by her stepfather that she needed emergency surgery. Most of the other doctors transferred to different hospitals within a year, but Sarah stayed. She quickly earned a reputation as the doctor who never gave up. When other physicians declared patients too far gone, Sarah would keep working. She had an unusual ability to connect with patients, speaking to them in Spanish when needed, holding their hands during procedures, and treating everyone with the same level of care regardless of their insurance status or criminal history. The gang members knew her name. Drug dealers would bring their friends to St. Mary's specifically asking for Dr. Martinez. She treated police officers and the criminals they arrested with equal compassion. Her approach was simple. Everyone deserved to live, and it wasn't her job to judge their past decisions. Sarah's dedication came at a personal cost. She worked 70-hour weeks and rarely took vacations. She had no time for dating, and her relationships with friends from medical school faded as they moved on to more traditional careers. Her mother worried that Sarah was sacrificing too much, but Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The hospital staff loved working with her. Nurses would request to be assigned to her shifts because she treated them as equals and never lost her temper, even during the most chaotic nights. She remembered everyone's names, asked about their families, and brought coffee for the overnight security guards. But the work was taking its toll. Every night brought new traumas, new faces of people whose lives had been shattered by violence. Sarah began having nightmares about patients she couldn't save. She started drinking wine to help her sleep, And eventually, she needed the wine just to relax after work. She told herself it was normal, that every emergency room doctor dealt with stress this way. The breaking point should have come when she treated her third child, gunshot victim in 1 week. 8-year-old Marcus was caught in crossfire between two rival gangs while walking to school. Sarah worked on him for 6 hours, and he survived, but he would never walk again. That night, Sarah went home and drank an entire bottle of wine while staring at the wall of her apartment. Instead of taking a break, Sarah threw herself deeper into her work. She started volunteering at free clinics on her days off, teaching first aid classes at community centers, and organizing medical supply drives for homeless shelters. She became known throughout the South Side as the doctor who cared, the one who would always find a way to help. The community embraced her as one of their own. Patients would bring her homemade food. Children would draw pictures for her, and gang members would nod respectfully when they saw her on the street. Sarah had found her purpose, but she was also losing herself in the process. Her apartment was sparse and functional, with medical journals stacked everywhere and takeout containers in the sink. She had no hobbies, no romantic interests, and no life outside of the hospital. Her identity had become completely wrapped up in being Dr. Martinez, the savior of the South Side. The first sign of trouble came when Sarah started making small mistakes at work. She mixed up medications once, forgot to order a necessary test for a patient, and snapped at a nurse who asked her to repeat instructions. Her supervisor, Dr. Williams, noticed the changes and suggested she take some time off, but Sarah insisted she was fine. The second sign was when Sarah began carrying her father's old revolver in her purse. She told herself it was just for protection, given the neighborhood where she worked and the late hours she kept. She got her concealed carry permit and practiced at a shooting range on Sunday mornings, the only time she wasn't at the hospital or clinic. The third sign was when Sarah stopped sleeping altogether. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every patient she had lost, every family she had to deliver bad news to, every child who came in broken by the violence of their community. The wine wasn't helping anymore, and she was afraid to take sleeping pills because she needed to be alert for work. Sarah's mother visited her one Sunday and was shocked by what she saw. Her daughter had lost 20 pounds, had dark circles under her eyes, and seemed to be running on pure adrenaline and caffeine. When her mother suggested that Sarah needed help, Sarah became defensive and asked her to leave. The final sign was when Sarah started seeing threats everywhere. She became convinced that the gang members she treated were watching her, that someone was following her car, that the hospital parking garage was dangerous. She began varying her routes home and checking her locks multiple times before bed. But despite all these warning signs, Sarah continued to be an exceptional doctor. Her patients still loved her, her success rate was still impressive, and she was still the first person everyone called when they needed help with a difficult case. From the outside, Dr. Sarah Martinez looked like she was at the top of her game. The truth was she was falling apart. And on a cold night in February, 15 years after she first walked into an emergency room determined to save lives, Sarah would discover that sometimes the people who spend their lives healing others are the ones who are most in need of healing themselves. The community that had embraced her, the patients who trusted her, and the colleagues who depended on her had no idea that their hero was carrying a loaded gun and fighting battles in her mind that were just as dangerous as anything happening on the streets outside. Sarah had spent so long focused on saving everyone else that she had forgotten to save herself, and that oversight was about to change everything, not just for her, but for everyone whose life she had touched during her 15 years of service. The stage was set for a tragedy that no one saw coming, least of all the woman who had dedicated her life to preventing exactly this kind of devastating outcome. Sarah Martinez, the healer, was about to become something she never thought possible, the one who would need healing the most. The night that changed everything started like any other Tuesday at St. Pateros, Mary's Hospital. Sarah arrived for her evening shift at 6 o'clock, grabbing her third cup of coffee of the day from the break room and checking the patient board. It was already showing red, meaning the emergency room was at capacity with critical cases waiting. Her first patient was Maria Gonzalez, a 19-year-old who had been beaten unconscious by her boyfriend. Maria's face was so swollen that Sarah could barely see her eyes, and x-rays showed 3 broken ribs and a fractured wrist. As Sarah worked to stabilize her, Maria whispered through split lips that she was pregnant and begged Sarah not to tell anyone, especially not the police officer waiting to take her statement. Sarah's heart broke a little more. the way it did every time she treated another young woman whose life had been shattered by someone who claimed to love her. She had seen hundreds of domestic violence cases, but they never got easier. She gently explained to Maria that she needed to report the pregnancy to ensure proper care, but promised to keep her safe. The second case was 12-year-old David, brought in by his grandmother after he collapsed at school. Sarah quickly diagnosed severe malnutrition and dehydration. The boy weighed only 60 pounds and hadn't had a proper meal in days. His mother was addicted to heroin, and his grandmother was doing her best on Social Security. But it wasn't enough. Sarah arranged for the hospital social worker to get involved and made sure David got a full meal from the cafeteria. Case after case followed the same pattern. Lives destroyed by poverty, violence, addiction, and neglect. Sarah moved through her shift like a machine, treating gunshot wounds, overdoses, car accident victims, and sick children whose families couldn't afford regular health care. By midnight, she had seen 23 patients, and more kept coming. During her brief break at 2 a.m, Sarah sat in her car in the hospital parking garage and took 3 swallows from the flask she had started keeping in her glove compartment. The whiskey burned, but it quieted the voices in her head, the ones that whispered that she wasn't making any difference, that she was just putting bandages on problems that were too big to solve. She had been drinking more heavily for the past 6 months, ever since treating twin brothers who were shot in a drive-by shooting. One died on her table while the other watched from the bed next to him. Sarah still woke up some nights hearing the surviving twin scream his brother's name. When Sarah returned to the emergency room, she found chaos. A multi-car accident had brought in 5 critical patients all at once, and the staff was overwhelmed. Sarah threw herself into the work performing emergency surgery on a construction worker whose chest had been crushed, intubating a teenager who was barely breathing, and coordinating care for a family of 4 who had been hit by a drunk driver. Construction worker died at 4:30 in the morning. Despite 6 hours of Sarah's best efforts, she had to walk to the waiting room and tell his wife and 3 young children that Daddy wasn't coming home. The wife collapsed in Sarah's arms, screaming that she couldn't raise the kids alone, begging Sarah to do something, anything, to bring him back. Sarah went to the bathroom and threw up, then splashed cold water on her face and went back to work. She had 4 more hours left on her shift, and people needed her to be strong. She couldn't fall apart, not when so many lives depended on her ability to function. By the time Sarah's shift ended at 8 in the morning, she had lost 2 patients and saved 11 others. The mathematical part of her brain knew that was a good ratio, that she had made a positive difference, but the human part of her brain only remembered the faces of the people she couldn't save, the families she had to comfort, the children who would grow up without parents. Sarah drove home through the morning traffic, fighting to keep her eyes open. She hadn't slept properly in 3 days, and the exhaustion was making everything seem surreal. She found herself running red lights without realizing it and swerving into other lanes. When she finally reached her apartment, she sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to remember how she had gotten there. Inside her apartment, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine, even though it was barely 9 in the morning. She told herself she needed it to sleep, that it was medicinal, that doctors throughout history had used alcohol to cope with the stresses of their profession. She finished the glass and poured another. The phone rang at 10:30. It was Dr. Williams, her supervisor, calling to check on her. He had noticed that Sarah seemed tired and stressed lately, and he was worried about her well-being. Sarah put on her professional voice and assured him she was fine, just dealing with some personal issues that would resolve soon. She promised to take a vacation day later in the week, but Sarah had no intention of taking time off. She couldn't afford to stop working, couldn't afford to think about what was happening to her mentally and emotionally. Work was the only thing that gave her life meaning, the only thing that made her feel valuable. Without the hospital, without her patients, who was she? Sarah tried to sleep but couldn't stop thinking about all the cases from her shift. She replayed every decision, wondering if she could have done something differently, if she could have saved the construction worker, if she could have helped Maria find the courage to leave her abusive boyfriend. The thoughts spun in circles until she got up and had another drink. The pattern continued for weeks. Sarah would work increasingly long shifts, drink to cope with the stress, get minimal sleep, and then return to work exhausted and on edge. She stopped eating regular meals, lost more weight, and began snapping at nurses and residents who didn't meet her impossibly high standards. Her apartment became a disaster zone. Mail piled up unopened, Dishes grew moldy in the sink, and empty wine bottles accumulated faster than she could throw them away. She stopped answering calls from her mother and avoided her friends from medical school who occasionally reached out. The breaking point came on a Saturday night in January. Sarah had been working for 14 straight hours when they brought in 16-year-old Carlos, a gang member who had been shot in the chest during a turf war. As Sarah worked to save his life, she recognized him as someone she had treated twice before for similar injuries. Carlos survived the surgery, but as Sarah was cleaning up, she overheard him on the phone with someone, planning retaliation against the gang that shot him. He was talking about killing a rival gang member's little sister to send a message. Sarah realized that by saving Carlos, she might have enabled him to commit more violence, to destroy more families. That night, Sarah sat in her car in the hospital parking garage and seriously considered not going home. She thought about driving to Lake Michigan and walking into the water, ending the cycle of pain and exhaustion that her life had become. She sat there for 2 hours, drinking from her flask and crying, before finally starting her car and driving home. The next morning, Sarah woke up on her couch, still in her scrubs, with an empty bottle of wine on the coffee table and no memory of how she had gotten home. She was supposed to work another shift that evening, but she called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Instead of resting, Sarah spent the day cleaning her apartment and trying to convince herself that she was fine, that she just needed to get organized and take better care of herself. She threw away the empty bottles, did laundry, and bought groceries. She felt better for a few hours, like she was getting her life back under control. But that evening, alone in her clean apartment with nothing to distract her from her thoughts, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine, and then another and another. She started thinking about all the patients she had lost, all the children who had died despite her best efforts, all the families she had failed to save. The guilt and grief felt overwhelming. Sarah opened her father's revolver and loaded it with 6 bullets. She told herself she was just checking to make sure it worked properly, that she needed to be prepared to protect herself. But as she held the gun in her hands, she felt a strange sense of power and control that she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had options. The gun represented the possibility of ending her pain, but also the possibility of taking control of her life in a way she never had before. She put the gun back in its case, but she didn't unload it. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. Sarah would work exhausting shifts, drink to cope, and spend her time off cleaning her gun and thinking about the power it represented. She started carrying it with her everywhere, even to work, though she kept it locked in her car. Sarah's colleagues began to notice changes in her behavior. She became more aggressive with difficult patients, less patient with worried families, and increasingly critical of other doctors' decisions. She started volunteering for the most dangerous cases, taking risks that other physicians wouldn't consider. Dr. Williams called Sarah into his office for a formal conversation about her performance. He expressed concern about her recent behavior and strongly suggested that she take advantage of the hospital's employee assistance program. Sarah became defensive and accused him of questioning her competence. She stormed out of his office without agreeing to seek help. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment with her loaded gun on the coffee table, drinking wine and thinking about how alone she felt. Everyone wanted to help her, but no one understood what she was going through. She was tired of being strong, tired of being the one everyone depended on, tired of carrying the weight of so many other people's pain. Sarah made a decision that night. She was going to continue working and helping people, but she was also going to protect herself. If someone threatened her, if someone tried to hurt her the way so many of her patients had been hurt, she would be ready to fight back. The gun would stay loaded, and she would carry it with her. 2 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday night in February, Sarah would discover that the line between protecting yourself and destroying everything you've worked for is much thinner than she ever imagined. The woman who had spent 15 years healing others was about to learn what it felt like to inflict a wound that could never be healed. February 14, 2019, started with Sarah waking up on her bathroom floor at 11 in the morning. She had no memory of how she got there, but the empty wine bottle next to the toilet told part of the story. Her head pounded as she pulled herself up and looked in the mirror at a woman she barely recognized. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her cheekbones were sharp from weight loss, and her hands shook as she reached for her toothbrush. Sarah was scheduled to work the evening shift, which meant she had 8 hours to pull herself together and pretend to be functional. She showered, forced down some toast and coffee, and spent an hour doing breathing exercises she had learned in medical school to calm her nerves. The loaded revolver sat in its case on her bedroom dresser, and she found herself staring at it for several minutes before putting it in her purse. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital took her through the heart of the neighborhood she had served for so many years. She passed the community center where she had volunteered as a teenager, the corner where Mrs. Rodriguez had died all those years ago, and the apartment building where 3 of her former patients lived with their families. This place had shaped her into who she was. But lately it felt like a prison she couldn't escape. Sarah arrived at work 30 minutes early and sat in her car, taking sips from the flask in her glove compartment. The whiskey helped steady her hands and quiet the anxious thoughts racing through her mind. She checked her appearance in the rearview mirror, applied lipstick to give herself some color, and walked into the hospital with the confident stride that everyone expected from Dr. Martinez. The emergency room was unusually quiet for a Valentine's Day evening. Sarah's first patient was an elderly man having chest pains who turned out to be suffering from heartburn, not a heart attack. Her second was a woman who had cut her hand while preparing dinner for her boyfriend. Easy cases that allowed Sarah to function on autopilot while her mind wandered to darker places. At 9 o'clock, the quiet was shattered when paramedics brought in 22-year-old Angela Torres, who had been beaten nearly to death by her ex-boyfriend. Angela's face was unrecognizable, both arms were broken, and she was bleeding internally. Sarah threw herself into the work of saving Angela's life, performing emergency surgery to stop the internal bleeding and stabilize her condition. As Sarah worked on Angela, she learned more of the story from the police officers who had responded to the scene. Angela's ex-boyfriend, Miguel Santos, had a history of domestic violence and had violated a restraining order by breaking into her apartment. When Angela tried to call for help, Miguel had beaten her with a baseball bat and left her for dead. Neighbors had heard her screams and called 911. Angela survived the surgery, but barely. Sarah had to break 3 ribs to access her internal injuries, and it would be months before she could walk normally again. When Sarah finally emerged from the operating room at midnight, she found Angela's mother and teenage sister waiting in the hallway, holding each other and crying. Sarah delivered the update about Angela's condition to her family, explaining that she would survive but faced a long recovery. Angela's mother grabbed Sarah's hands and thanked her repeatedly, calling her an angel, saying that God had sent Sarah to save her daughter. The weight of that gratitude felt crushing rather than uplifting. During her break, Sarah stepped outside into the cold February air and called the police detective handling Angela's case. She learned that Miguel Santos had been arrested at his cousin's house, drunk and still covered in Angela's blood. He was being held without bail and would likely face attempted murder charges. Sarah felt a mix of relief and rage that surprised her with its intensity. Sarah returned to work but couldn't concentrate. Every patient reminded her of Angela, and every domestic violence case she had ever treated came flooding back into her memory. She thought about all the women she had sewn back together, only to see them return months later with new injuries from the same men. She thought about the children who had been beaten by parents who claimed to love them. At 2 a.m, Sarah was called to treat a 17-year-old gang member who had been shot in the leg during a robbery attempt. As she worked on his wound, the boy bragged about the money he had stolen and joked about how easy it had been to scare the store owner. Sarah realized she was looking at someone who would likely hurt innocent people again and again, and she was helping him get back on the street to do it. The thought consumed her for the rest of her shift. By the time Sarah walked to her car at 8 a.m, she was seething with anger and frustration. She felt like she was fighting a war she could never win, patching up victims while their attackers walked free or served minimal sentences before returning to hurt more people. Sarah drove home through rush hour traffic, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She kept thinking about Miguel Santos sitting in jail, probably planning what he would do to Angela when he got out. She thought about the 17-year-old gang member who would be back on the streets within hours, looking for his next victim. Instead of going to her apartment, Sarah found herself driving to the courthouse where Miguel Santos would eventually be tried. She sat in the parking lot for an hour, wondering what kind of sentence he would receive, whether Angela would have the courage to testify against him, whether the justice system would actually protect her from future violence. From the courthouse, Sarah drove to Miguel's neighborhood, using the address she had gotten from the police report. She told herself she was just curious, that she wanted to understand the environment that had created someone capable of such violence. But as she parked across the street from the rundown apartment building where Miguel lived, Sarah felt the weight of the loaded gun in her purse. Sarah sat in her car for 3 hours watching people come and go from Miguel's building. She saw children playing in the broken playground, elderly residents carrying groceries up the cracked steps, and young men gathered on the corner who kept looking over their shoulders for police. This was a community trapped by poverty and violence, just like the one where she had grown up. Around noon, Sarah saw a familiar figure walking toward the building. It was Miguel's cousin, Carlos. The same Carlos she had saved multiple times in the emergency room. The same Carlos she had overheard planning retaliation against rival gang members. He was laughing with his friends, showing no sign that his cousin had nearly beaten a woman to death the night before. Something snapped inside Sarah. She watched Carlos disappear into the building and felt 15 years of suppressed rage boiling over. She thought about every patient she had lost, every family she had failed to save, every violent criminal she had helped recover so they could hurt more people. She thought about Angela's broken face and her mother's tears and her sister's terrified eyes. Sarah reached into her purse and felt the cold metal of her father's revolver. For the first time in months, her hands weren't shaking. She felt calm and focused in a way that frightened and exhilarated her. She checked the bullets, put the gun back in her purse, and got out of her car. Sarah walked across the street and into the apartment building like she had every right to be there. The lobby smelled like urine and cigarettes, and half the lights were burned out. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, following the apartment numbers until she found the one that matched the address from the police report. She knocked on the door and waited, her heart pounding, but her mind strangely clear. When Carlos opened the door, his eyes widened in surprise. He recognized her immediately as the doctor who had saved his life, and he smiled with genuine warmth. "Dr. Martinez, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" Sarah looked at Carlos and saw everything wrong with the world she had dedicated her life to healing. She saw the violence that had destroyed so many of her patients, the cycle of harm that she was powerless to break, the system that failed victims while protecting their attackers. "I need to talk to you about Miguel," Sarah said, her voice steady and cold. Carlos invited her inside, still smiling, still treating her with the respect and affection that so many of her former patients showed her. The apartment was small and crowded, with several people watching television and playing cards. Carlos introduced her as the doctor who had saved his life, and everyone greeted her warmly. Sarah felt like she was watching herself from outside her body as Carlos led her to the kitchen for privacy. She looked at this young man who had called her his guardian angel, who had sent her Christmas cards for the past 3 years, who had named his daughter after her. He was also someone who sold drugs to children, who had shot at least 3 people that she knew of, who was planning to kill a rival gang member's sister. "Miguel messed up bad last night," Carlos said, shaking his head. "That girl didn't deserve what he did to her. He was drunk and crazy, and now he's going to prison for a long time. I tried to tell him to leave her alone, but he wouldn't listen." Sarah listened to Carlos talk about Miguel's violence like it was a regrettable mistake rather than a deliberate choice to brutalize an innocent woman. She thought about Angela lying unconscious in the ICU, and she felt something inside her chest break open like a dam bursting. "You don't understand," Sarah said, reaching into her purse. "None of you understand what you do to people. I've spent 15 years trying to fix what you break, and I can't do it anymore." Carlos saw the gun before Sarah fully pulled it from her purse. His expression changed from warmth to confusion to fear in the space of 3 seconds. He raised his hands and started to back away, but Sarah was already pointing the revolver at his chest. "Dr. Martinez, what are you doing? Put that away, please. You're scaring me." Sarah looked at Carlos and saw every violent criminal she had ever treated, every perpetrator of the suffering she witnessed every day. She saw the future victims he would create, the families he would destroy, the lives he would shatter. She thought about Angela and her mother's tears and her sister's fear. "I'm tired of being the one who cleans up your messes," Sarah said, her finger moving to the trigger. "I'm tired of saving people who destroy other people." The gun fired once, the sound echoing through the small apartment like thunder. Carlos stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. He looked at Sarah with shock and betrayal, the same expression she had seen on so many patients when they realized their bodies were failing them. Sarah stood frozen, still holding the smoking gun, watching blood spread across Carlos's shirt.